Morning. We're starting off in Matthew chapter 22 today. I don't know if everybody's as tired as I am, if it's because it's getting darker early or what. My sleep has been all thrown off. I've just been very drained. And I think part of it is probably because how chaotic this time of year is. So much stuff going on. You know, you're trying to, get all your Christmas shopping done, and you're trying to plan all your meals and make sure you got all the food for the things you're going to be going to, and well, what do I get for this person or that person, and what do kids even like anymore, and what is this one into, and it can be chaotic. It can get overcomplicated, and sometimes that happens with things like the Christmas season. It should be a time of peace. It should be a time of joy and peace and celebration. And sometimes life just ends up overwhelming. It ends up burdensome and stressful instead of peaceful and loving. Sometimes it's a back and forth, but a lot of times that steals our joy. It steals our energy. And we need to be careful not to overcomplicate things that should be so simple. And that's something that happened in Israel with the law. These people were overburdened by legalism, the sense of legalism, and this Mosaic law that had just become so overwhelming from what it once was. And these religious leaders, we know they were always, we know what they're like, the Pharisees and the Sadducees that were always striving for more power. They were always wanting to be seen as the greatest, but they had overburdened the people with what the law had become. It started out simple. God didn't give Moses 10,000 commandments. He kept it simple in the beginning. And what they had done, they had taken this simple law that God gave them, and they had developed it into 613 different laws. And it was just this massive mess of a legal system. They turned 10 commandments into 613 laws, and they chose 613 because that's how many characters, how many letters were in the text of the original 10 commandments. So they thought, well, for each letter, we'll make a different rule. It sounds a lot like the red tape kind of bureaucracy that we deal with a lot of times today. There's a regulation for every breath you take. But they wanted 613 laws because that's how many letters were in the text of the 10 Commandments. And then they went through the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, what they had at the time. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. They went through and they found 613 rules in there. And then they took those and they divided them into 2 lists. They made a list of affirmative commands, basically do this, and negative commands, don't do this. So you've got a great big list of what you got to do and a great big list of what you're not supposed to do. And they of the affirmative commands that you have to do, they came up with 248 rules, and then and this was based on one for each part of the body as they understood it at that time, 248 rules. And then as far as the negative rules, don't do this, they came up with 365 rules. There's obviously one for each day of the year. So then they divided the list into binding commands and non-binding commands, and then they basically just spent their days after that just debating back and forth on whether they divided these things up rightly, and then they would rank the importance of these different rules and demands. It sounds like a bunch of nonsense busy work to overcomplicate people's minds and lives. They took something that God gave to give man life, to bring us better and more abundant life, and they turned it into something that was just taxing, something that just wore on people, something that just the thought of probably just felt overwhelming. And so when we think about this, we can see how legalism became so prevalent. this idea that, what matters most is following the law, because it's what they had driven down their throats all the time. And do you see how hopelessly impossible it must have felt to be a righteous person, or to consider yourself a righteous person at that time? Or how hopelessly impossible it must have felt to please God. It would have just felt like a chore. We can see how overburdened they would have been, how much of a chore it would have felt like to serve God. And sadly, I think a lot of people look at religion like that today. Well, I'm going to have to do this, and this, and I can't do this, and this. I mean, do you think God was really happy about what they did to these simple, life-giving commands that he gave, these 10 simple commandments? I mean, obviously there's other things in Scripture, but they boil down easily. And thankfully, he did something about it. This time of year, we're reminded of the birth of Jesus and what his coming to earth meant, and why he came to us. We know that he came to save us from our sin. He came to seek and save the lost. And thankfully, within the context of that, he came and did something about this cumbersome legal system that they had. But he didn't just come and destroy it. See, that's the thing. Jesus said in Matthew 5, I didn't come to abolish the law. I didn't come to destroy the law. I came to fulfill it. He did what nobody else could do. He did the impossible. He lived that perfect life and became that sacrifice. He came to fulfill what they could never do and what we could never do. And he made it simple again. Now let's look at Matthew chapter 22 for a moment. And I'm not going to read the full text where I'm at here, but starting at verse 15, and verses 15 through 22, we see where the Pharisees were trying to trip Jesus up, as they often did, on taxes. And this is the passage where they say, is it lawful to pay taxes? They wanted him, he kept making them look bad with the way he was speaking and teaching, and they were trying to find a way to just kill his image in the eyes of the people. It was like mudslinging media we'd see today, trying to ruin somebody's reputation so people will stop listening to them. And so he said, okay, is it right to pay taxes? Is it lawful to pay taxes? They were trying to catch him up, because if he said, no, it's not, leave these people alone and quit taking all their money, then, Uncle Sam would have been after him, or Uncle Caesar. But if he would have said what they wanted to hear and said, oh yeah, they should pay taxes, then all those people who were getting bled dry left and right would have been upset with him. And we know he put him to shame with it. He said, okay, whose image and inscription is on this coin? And they said, Caesar's. And he said, render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. So you know what? Give Caesar what's his and give God what's his. And he wouldn't let them suck him into this debate that would have made him look bad depending on which side he chose. So he shut up the Pharisees there. And then the Sadducees, in verses 23 through 33, they tried to trip him up on family redeemers and marriages in the resurrection, because they had a custom then that if a woman was widowed, her husband died, then the next brother would marry her and basically carry on that first brother's name, carry on his legacy. They would have have a son in that person's name to carry on the inheritance. It was a tradition that they had, so these family lines wouldn't wouldn't die off. And he's saying, okay, so what happens if people do what they're supposed to do, and they have this family redeemer, and the brother dies, and then the next one marries her, and then that brother dies, and the next one. Well, what if she ends up having 7 husbands? What happens then in the resurrection? Basically saying, once you get to heaven, is it okay to have 7 husbands? Or which one is the rightful husband? They're trying to confuse him up, and he he puts them to shame too, and he shuts them up. And he's like, there's not marriage in heaven. He said, you're mistaken, not knowing the scriptures and the power of God. For verse 30, for in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels of God in heaven. But concerning the resurrection of the dead, you have not read what was spoken to you by God, saying, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. God is not the God of the dead, but of the living. And in verse 33 here, it says something important. It says, and when the multitudes heard this, they were astonished at his teaching. These guys keep trying to trip him up, and it just keeps backfiring. The Pharisees try to trip him up on taxes, and he makes them look stupid. And the Sadducees try to trip him up on marriage, and not only does he make them look stupid and prove that they don't know Scripture and point out that they don't know Scripture rightly, the crowds were astonished by them. They're trying to make the crowds hate him and stop following him, and he's just impressing them. They're just giving him more chances to show how awesome he is. So they weren't happy about this. Obviously, if I were in their shoes, I wouldn't be happy. Glad I'm not in their shoes. I don't really care for them. Verses 34 and 36, we'll see what happens. But when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. Then one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question, testing him and saying, Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? So you see what's happening here? They weren't happy. He put them to shame. So they all huddled up and they brainstormed. It says they all gathered together. So they come up with a plan. They're like, okay, between us, we're the smartest people we think we know. Or we think we're the smartest people we know, right? We got to be able to come up with some way of tripping this guy up. And once we figure it out, we're sending the lawyer. So we're going to make sure he says it right. We're going to make sure that he can't trip us up in a technicality or something. So they come up with this best plan that they can come up with, and they send the lawyer to word their trap just right. And look at how they approach him. Look at what they're coming at him with. Think about how complicated this law is. Think of what they've turned it into. Think about the fact that everybody out there is just constantly, well, there's this law and there's that law, and how do I keep track of it all? And these guys themselves, who were supposed to be the authorities on it, would debate daily on whether this was right or that was right or this is more important. And so they're saying, okay, you tell us which is the greatest commandment in the law. They're taking something that they debated over daily, and they're asking him, okay, you make sense of it for everybody. You're so smart. Let's see what you can do. Let's see where it got him. Verse 36. Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? Jesus said to them, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Jesus put them to shame by simplifying into one word something that they had turned into an entire legal system: love. He says, on these two commandments, love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. The law and the prophets is basically the Old Testament. You know, the first section is the law, and then the last section is the prophets, and that's most of what they had and what they knew. And Jesus is saying every bit of that can be summed up in these two things. They took something that was so overcomplicated, people debated on it constantly, and the people were lost on how to follow it. And he made it simple, and that's what Jesus does. This legalism complicates things. The whole concept of legal, it still exists today. You got to do this, and you got to do that, and you can't do that. Yeah, God has commandments, but it's not what we're basing our salvation on, our faith, our life in Him. It's legalism. It complicates, and love simplifies. Now, just because it simplifies it doesn't mean it's easy. Something can be very, very simple and still be hard. I mean, a lot of us, if at one point or another, either lived in the country or known someone who has, and I think we'd probably all agree it's a lot more of a simple life than living in like Manhattan or something. But not a lot of people that live in the country would call it easy. There's still a lot of work. It's just not overcomplicated with nonsense. And love is the same way. And a lot of times that's because we don't make it easy to love us. But a lot of other people don't make it easy to love them either. So it's simple, and it sums it up. But that doesn't mean that it's easy. So how does love simplify the law? How does love simplify these 613 rules and regulations, these do's and don'ts? And how does it diffuse this legalism? Romans chapter 13, verses 8 through 10 says, "Owe no one anything except to love one another. For he who loves another has fulfilled the law. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not covet. And if there is any other commandment, they're summed up in this saying, namely, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law." It's not just about having thoughts of love or feelings of love for somebody. It's about loving in action. It's about making every decision in life based on and rooted in love. Whether that love is for God or for other people or neighbors or both. It's about making every decision based on and rooted in love. You know, even lawyers today have to look up a lot of legal codes when they're working on a case. They don't have it all memorized. There's too much to memorize. And, you know, how can we honestly expect anybody to possibly memorize, let alone follow all these hundreds of do's and don'ts? I mean, that alone might keep you out of trouble because you're too busy studying it and trying to memorize it to actually do anything in life. And even aside from those, we agonize over, well, is this the right thing to do? Is God going to be upset if I do this? Or should I do this? And we overcomplicate and we agonize over what's right and wrong, and we overcomplicate it like they did to some degree. But love sums up, it says love is the fulfillment of the law. And in some translations it says love sums up the law. It can all be wrapped up into that. I mean, put it to the test of love. If there's something that you're trying to figure out, whether should I do this, should I not do this, is it something that you would do to someone that you love rightly? Is it something that you would do or not do? Is it how you would treat or obey the God that you truly love? Now, even the Ten Commandments are fully covered by loving God and loving our neighbors. And if we really understood the importance of that, he wouldn't have really needed to make 10 of them. You know, first commandment, don't have any other gods. You're not going to have any other gods if you love the true God. You're not going to make idols to other gods if you love him. It says, don't take the Lord's name in vain, third commandment. We're not going to misuse the name of someone we love. Remember the Sabbath, keep it holy. We're going to honor God we love. We should need a reminder to honor him. Honor your parents. You do that if you love them. If you don't, you're less likely to. Don't murder. I mean, some people might murder people that they love. I don't know if it's... You see some of these crazy murder stories on TV. Jealousy and things like that. But is it really love? Do you murder someone out of love? If you love them, you're not going to murder them. If you love somebody, you're not going to commit adultery against them. If you love somebody, you're not going to steal their stuff. If you love somebody, you're not going to lie about them, bear false witness about them. If you love somebody, You don't covet that. You're not jealous of what they have. You're just happy for them that they're doing well. And coveting other people's things in the 10th commandment. Love sums up the law. If I'm truly loving people and I'm truly loving God, and I base my decisions on that, it simplifies things. Just simple love. And a lot of people understood that. David understood that in Psalms. John understood that in his epistles. There's so many people throughout this time that were just overburdened by the law, and it was a chore to them. In Psalm 19, David writes, "The law of the Lord is perfect, converting the soul." Another version says, reviving the soul. Does that sound like something that wears you down? No, it sounds like something he loves because he understands it. 1 John 5, he says, "By this we know that we love the children of God, when we love God and keep his commandments. For this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments. And his commandments are not burdensome." Does this sound like somebody who feels overtaxed by the law? Because he understands it boils down to love. Galatians 5:14 says, "For all the law is fulfilled in one word, even in this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself." Think of how simple this must have felt to them, these people that were just exhausted by the idea of all these laws, for Jesus to come along and just make it so simple for them. What a weight that must have felt removed from something that was just so exhausting. I mean, probably at one point or another, there's been something in our life or some situation in our life that was just so exhausting that the thought of it almost takes your breath away. And what a weight is lifted once that's resolved. And how much relief they must have felt having this pulled from them. It's all fulfilled in one word. Love your neighbor as yourself. It must have been so much simpler. I mean, think about how much easier it is to treat people rightly when it's somebody we love. I mean, we all have somebody we love. Think how much easier it is to treat them well than people that we maybe don't like so much. Think about how much more patience we have for someone we love than that idiot on the freeway. Think about how much more forgiving we are with someone we love than that boss that just hollered at us. Think about how much further we're willing to go for someone we love than a stranger. But what if we actually fulfilled God's law and loved all our neighbors like God commands us to? What might this world look like? You know, we tell ourselves it's too hard to love some people. I've said it. Most of you probably at least thought it. Some people are just too hard to love. And we tell ourselves that we don't know how. I don't know how to love that person. And that's nonsense because God's shown us how. He's already shown us how by loving us. Because I deserve his love even less than other people deserve mine. Shall love your neighbor as yourself. What if you loved your neighbors the same way that God loved you? What if I loved all my neighbors the same way that God loved me? Sounds simple. It is hard sometimes. It's not impossible. And we need to do it the way he loves us, not because it's deserved, but because it's right. And because it is good, and because it fulfills God's law. It's what he wants for us. This world would change overnight if all his people did that. Galatians 5:22 and 23 is a passage we know well. It's about the fruit of the Spirit. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, that $50 word from earlier about patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such, there is no law. there's no law against those things because they embody the fulfillment of the law. And if we want to fulfill God's law in true simplicity, without it overburdening us, without it wearing us down, without constantly worrying, oh, am I doing everything perfect? All we need is the fruit of the Spirit. All we need is that love. And how do we get that fruit of the Spirit? When we come to Christ, and the Holy Spirit dwells within us and starts growing all these things. Fruit grows, and God grows it in us. And the more we cultivate that, the more we nurture it, the more we feed and weed that garden and water it, the closer we draw toward God, the closer He's going to draw toward us. And the more these things are going to be outpouring in our lives, and the more we're going to have reminders to be that love to everyone around us. And it'll make it so much simpler. Instead of thinking, well, should I do this because they've got it coming, or because this is what I deserve, or should I not do that? What would I do if I loved them? And what would I do if I truly and rightly loved God?